Okay, Chodesh Tov to everybody. It's a great day to be starting a new Masechet, new month, a new Masechet. We're very excited about Masechet Yoma. I know Shkalim was a bit of a challenge for some people. So just so you know, you'll see already today, Yoma is a lot lighter to a certain extent, even though the content is obviously a little bit heavy, Yom Kippurim, but the style of the Gemara is much simpler. You'll be very pleasantly pleased when you get through today's daf. Okay, there's a sheet, so follow in the sheet. A few words about the sheet, especially to people who are new. I try to make a worksheet every day when I can. It's all in Hebrew at this point. I use different fonts, which are very important to distinguish between the different levels that the Gemara is made up of. The Gemara is made up of Tanaitic material from the time of the Mishnah and constantly quoting Braito, which are ones that never made it into the Mishnah or any other book, but they were known by the people of the time. So all that material that's Tanaitic is all in a red font, a different font and a different color, in order to show every time the Gemara is quoting from somewhere else. It makes it much easier to be able to get through the Gemara when you understand how to distinguish between things that the Amoraim are using, they're speaking, the people of the time of the Gemara, and when they're quoting from earlier sources. Earlier sources always have a higher status also. If they contradict what an Amora says, then he has to come up with some sort of answer, how to answer the contradiction. Whereas two Tanaitic sources, for example, can actually contradict each other. The second thing is on the page, there's purple font, a purple color and a different font, which is a more handwritten font, which is psukim. Okay, words from the Torah appear in a different font, just so you understand that those are quotes from the psukim. Okay, it's also important to distinguish where's a pasuk and where, because the Gemara is made up of quotes from all different types of outside sources. Okay, let's do our dedications for today and for this Masechet, and then we'll start with some introductory words about Masechet Yoma. Masechet Yoma is sponsored by Vicky Harari in commemoration of my father's Yurtzeit on Pesach Sheni, 14th of Iyar, 5777. Avraham Baruch HaKohen ben Ze'ev Eliyahu Eckstein Zichrono Livracha. My father was a survivor of Auschwitz and a feminist before it was fashionable. He raised me to believe that women could achieve anything. He would be proud to know that his daughter is an avid learner of Hadran, and in gratitude to Michelle Cohen Farber for revolutionizing women's learning worldwide. Today's daf also has a few sponsors by Rabbi Ze'ev and Dr. Rebecca Felsen in honor of their daughter, Miriam Chaya Felsen, who was born when the Daf Yomi cycle last began Yoma. So now is one Daf Yomi cycle, 2,711 days old on this day. We're immensely proud of her, how much she has learned, how much she is learning, and how much she will, with Hashem's help, learn in the future. And by Eliza Avshalom, in memory and l'schut her mother and teacher in all things, Sarah Bat Esther and Aryeh Bellison, and in honor of her father and my father and teacher, David Bellison. May he live a long and good life, and thanks to Hadran and Rabbanit Farber, has become my virtual chavruta. And by Eileen Strauss, in memory of my mother, Leah Bat Yaakov, upon her 11th Yurtzeit, she taught me to love Judaism and make each and every holiday and Shabbat special. With that, talking about the special nature of holidays and Shabbat, so let's just talk for a minute about the name of our Masechet. The name of our Masechet is Yoma. And in fact, in this book that I reference sometimes called Mishnah Eretz Yisrael of Safrai, he actually mentions that not everyone called it Masechet Yoma. Okay, so he mentions, he said that some people refer to it as Masechet Kippurim, okay, like Yom Kippurim. So like the atonement. So the Masechet of Atonement. But we're known to call this Yoma. What is Yoma? So in Aramaic, kamatz, an a with an aleph at the end of a word is like a hey in the beginning of the word. It's called the hey yediah, which is the day. It literally translates as the day. And in fact, this theme we're going to see in our daf today, which is the concept that this was a unique day that has no other right than the day. What do you mean? There's 365 days a year, in the Hebrew calendar, 354. What is the day? Every day is the day. No, this is the day, highlight of the year. And we're going to talk about what makes this day so unique. And then the structure of the Mishnah, it's 8 chapters long. 7 chapters are going to be entirely about the Kohen Gadol and the work, the avodah, they call it, that he did, the sacrifices and all the other things that he did on Yom Kippur for atonement for the people. Only in the 8th chapter, we're going to get to laws of the fast and all sorts of, it's a very famous chapter. It has all sorts of interesting things like pikuach nefesh and other interesting topics about, when you can override Shabbat to save someone. We're going to have all sorts of interesting sugyot when we get to the end. Until then, it's going to be mostly sacrifices. And you might say, wow, this is really not so relevant, right? Just kind of like shkalim. It's interesting. Just like shkalim at the end, we got to, well, what do we do nowadays? Interesting here also, we get to, well, where's this relevant at the end? But I'll promise you that both when you get to the Parshiot in the Torah, which we're going to get to soon, describing the work that the Kohen Gadol did, the Avodah, on Yom Kippur, and when you get to Yom Kippur davening, okay, we don't have the exact same thing that we had with Pesachim, where it ended just before Pesach, but we're going to end on July 8th, which is not so far before Yom Kippur. When you get to Yom Kippur this year, and in the davening, when we go through the whole description of everything the Kohen Gadol did, we're very lost and we don't really understand what's going on here. You're going to have a very different experience this year, really understanding what Yom Kippur is all about. I want to just show you again this map that I have from the Machon HaMikdash. Okay, it's an excellent map. There's maps you can find online. They're not as good as this. A lot of them just have numbers next to or letters next to each one, and then you can reference it. And in fact, there's pictures that we're going to have access to again, just like in Eruvin. So every day, if there's pictures, I'm going to put them up. It's from a link from the portal Hadaf HaYomi. So thank you to the portal Hadaf HaYomi for getting them. They're pictures actually from the Ma'orot Daf HaYomi. Portal Daf HaYomi is putting them up on their site, and we're going to have links every day when there are pictures. There's a few pictures today. I'm not going to always pull them up on the screen, but you can look. There'll be pictures today on the daf. They're already there now, so you can open them and see. There's some pictures we're going to see of Lishkat Paredrin. There's some pictures of Klei Galalim and Klei Avanim that we're going to talk about. When they're really necessary for understanding, then I'll pull them up on the screen here, but we're not always going to look at them. But there'll be some map, which I haven't found yet, but they're going to put up a map there. But I strongly recommend you order from the Machon HaMikdash. I'm going to send the links today in the WhatsApp groups. And the ones where I send the links to the daf. If you're not yet on those groups, you can join those groups from our website it's on the subscribe page, to get daily links to the daf, to all the materials that go up on Hadran's site, anything, an article written. There's some good intro articles, by the way, on Yoma, in Flashback by Shuli Mishkin and by Gita Neufeld, who wrote a great article, a very long intro to all the details of the Avodat Yom Kippurim. Shuli gave kind of a bit of a background to the whole thing. Definitely worth reading. The other thing I want to get to before we start is the order. Wouldn't you think that we would go in order of the holidays, right? We started with Pesach, and then we can go maybe to Shavuot, and then, well, there is no Masechet Shavuot. But if Rosh Hashanah, Sukkah, Yom Kippurim, Chag, right? You might have come up with Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkah, and then maybe Beitza, which is all about general holidays. But no, that's not the order. The order starts out with Yoma, then it goes to Sukkah, then it goes to Beitza, and it ends with Rosh Hashanah. So this is a question that perplexed many. Wasn't always the case, or not only the case. This is definitely the order of the Mishnah, but some Gemaras actually printed differently. The order is different. And in fact, Rosh Shiur Gaon says, this is the way the rabbis generally did it in the order that we have. But if you want to change the order, feel free. Okay, this is interesting. It's like saying, you can order the Gemara any way you want, really. The Daf Yomi cycle chose to go with this order, but there are different orders in different places. It's not always this way. And he obviously shows it doesn't really make such a difference how you order the Gemara. That's not what's important, even though for a Daf Yomi person, that seems very important because we're going specifically in order. Most people don't learn in order, and therefore it makes sense to say the order isn't really so significant. But I'm going to read you from the Rambam also. The Rambam in the Perush HaMishnah describes, it's always good when you're looking for order of the Masechet. He has his theories as to why things are ordered that way. So he basically starts and says, Pesachim comes after Shabbat because it's the first mitzvah that we were commanded by Moshe, and it's next to Shabbat in the section of the holidays. It goes Shabbat and then Pesach, so that makes sense. It's first. Then Shkalim, he says Keseder HaKatuv. He starts to say this goes by the order in the Torah. We have first Shkalim, Kitisa, then in Sefer Shmot, Then we jump to Sefer Vayikra. We have Acharei Mot comes first before we get to Parshat Emor, where it discusses all the other holidays. And therefore, he claims that Yom Kippur comes first because it's the order of the Torah, which is an interesting theory. Another possible reason, which is a very different type of approach, Rav Reuven Margaliot, who's alive today, he claims that the order of the Mishnah, and if you look at all the Mishnayot, the way it works in the Seder is you start from the Masechtot that have the most chapters, and then it gets less chapters, less chapters, less chapters. So Shabbat, we start a lot of chapters. Then Eruvin also, Psachim had 10, Shkalim had 8, this has 8. Then we get to Sukkah, which has 5, Beitzah has 5, Rosh Hashanah has 4. And he proves this throughout. There's a few exceptions to the rule, which there's explanations for, like the Bavas have 10 chapters, but actually they were all one big chapter of 30 before, and that's why Bava Kama starts off, right, that section. Then there's a whole bunch of also Sanhedrin and Makot used to be 1. So even though Sanhedrin has 10 and then Makot only has 3, Sanhedrin has 11, sorry. Then, as you start with the Bavas, then you have Sanhedrin, which is 11, then you have Makot, which is 3, but Makot used to be part of Sanhedrin. So that also makes sense that it doesn't jump down to 3, because then there's others that have more. Anyway, I think there might be a few exceptions here and there, but for the most part, it's actually true. And it could be why it's ordered in this way. In any case, let's get started with our chapter. Another possible reason, by the way, is that when we're going to get to the holidays, and the Shkalim is kind of the you need the background to be able to understand them and get into all the holidays. After we finish with Psachim, which maybe has its own unique and was first, but now we're going to get into Yom Kippur, which is the day, okay, the highlight. So let's start without further introduction. Shiv'at yamim kodem Yom Kippurim mafrishim kohen gadol mibeito lelishkat parhedrin. 7 days before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would leave his house, Beito. Beito has 2 meanings. We're going to see later in the Mishnah. Beito also means from his wife, not just from his house, but from his wife. I was thinking of my daughter who's studying for university, and she often leaves the house to study because in the house, you just can't focus. It's very hard to focus and study. We all know that. You get distracted by a million different things. And even though she's not distracted by laundry and cooking and things like that, like I am, but other distractions in the house. And it's always good to leave your house. That's where you get to focus. Now imagine, all the more so, the Kohen Gadol is preparing for Yom Kippur. Right? We all try before Yom Kippur to get mentally into the mindset. And he has obviously much more responsibility. And therefore we separate him. We're going to see in the Gemara why they say we separate. But there's this idea of leaving your house, getting a different perspective. Also, sometimes when you leave, it gives you perspective on things. Sometimes you're in the middle of your house and busy with everything going on. And when you walk out the door, all of a sudden you feel like a different person. It just gives you perspective. Oh, there's a world out there. There's other things. There's other people. It's not just about my family, right? The Kohen Gadol is in charge of asking for forgiveness for the entire people. So he has a strong responsibility. In addition, we're going to see he also has to separate from his wife. So all these, the Gemara is going to explain the reasons for later. So we'll get to that later. By the way, a nice, also for at the beginning of a chapter, Tosfot often has interesting things at the beginning of chapters that kind of gives perspective and connects it with different Masechtot. And he points out that the structure here, it starts with the word 7. And he basically says that many Masechtot start off with numbers, like Arba Avot Nizikin in Bava Kama. There's 4 main categories of damages. He quotes Rosh Hashanah, Arba'a Rashi Shanim. Okay, but then he compares it to other places where they say the number at the end of the sentence, like before the holidays of the Gentiles, 3 days they wouldn't be able to do business dealings with them, and how the numbers sometimes come at the end of a sentence. And he basically just compares these, and he gives a few examples of cases where that happens. A woman is acquired, but in 3 ways, right? That's how marriage goes on. Not all those, by the way, are at the beginning of, right? Some of the, right? That's at the beginning. Yeah, they're both actually the beginning of Masechtot. So he basically does a comparison of some beginning of Masechtot, which is always interesting. In any case, let's get back to this Kohen Gadol. So 7 days before Yom Kippur, Mafrishim Kohen Gadol mi beito lilishkat parhedrin. So he goes into what's called the Lishkat Parhedrin. I'll show you on the map. Again, here's our map. We have the Ezrat, Nashim, and that whole area. There's the entrance to the temple area. Then you go through here, you get to the Azara. This is where all the worship happened. Now, the Lishkat Peredrin is here on the northeastern side. It's near the eastern entrance to the Azara area, and it's right near where they would do the slaughtering. These are the Beit Mitzvahim. This is where they would slaughter the animals in this area on the northern side, because Kodshe Kodshim have to be slaughtered on the north. So we're going to get back to that later today. So he would do in Lishkat Parhedrin. On my Mac, by the way, it says Parhedrin. L and R are letters that switch off, right? You know, some people can't pronounce L and R properly. So they're interchangeable letters. And here also, I see Tova's here, my speech therapist, right? The L and the R. So the Parhedrin is also something that's called Palhedrin. Okay, there were different opinions about how to say the word. In any case, he would go to that. He would sit there for 7 days. Umatkinim lo kohen acher tachtav. Another thing we have to do is put in a replacement kohen gadol. We need a different Kohen Gadol to be in standing, a Kohen in waiting, just in case something were to happen to the Kohen Gadol. Okay, the first Rashi on the page explains to us, Kol Avodat Yom Kippurim Einach Shera Elabo. You can't do any of the worship without a Kohen Gadol. It has to be done with the Kohen Gadol. They learn it in Horayot because it says in Masechet Horayot, it's another Masechet, it says there, V'chipera Kohen Asher Yimshach Oto. Who's the Kohen that was Nimshach? It's the Kohen Gadol. We learned that in Shkalim about the anointing with the oil, the Shemen HaMishcha. So therefore, it has to be the Kohen Gadol. And therefore, if something were to happen to him, he became impure or he died or something, we'd need someone else. So we separate someone else. It's not clear exactly when we do this. If we do it 7 days before, we do it right before. It doesn't sound like he needs to also go to Lishkat Paradin for 7 days. That seems to be not a necessary factor. It's important, but you could do without it, because we're not going to make him do it just in case. If in case something happens, he comes in and, you know, he starts on the job right away. Shema ye'era psul, just in case he becomes tamei in some way, impure. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda adds, not just do we need a Kohen Gadol in waiting. Now you might be surprised. Okay, that not so surprising. This next line is a little surprising. Af isha acheret matkinim lo. We set up a woman in case his wife, in case something happens to his wife, Shema Tamut Ishto, in case his wife dies. Okay, here we're not worried that she'd be in the picture, but we're worried that she'd be alive. If he doesn't have a wife, it's going to be an issue, says Rabbi Yehuda. Why is it an issue? Shenema v'chiper ba'ado ba'ad beito, and beito zo ishto. That's where I told you before. Beito, your house, is a reference also to the wife. And it says the Kohen Gadol, one of the things he does on that day is he asks for atonement for himself and for his family, his household. And his household includes his wife. And if he doesn't have a wife, then he can't do the work the way he's supposed to, the ritual. Now, why this is, you could just say simply, Torah says so. You could try to come up with a reason, right? I was thinking about, it's commonly quoted that sometimes single rabbis have trouble finding jobs. People say, oh, we want a rabbi who's married, with experience, with, right? There's a certain approach of people that, oh, if you're not married, well, you know, there's something missing here. Now, whether you agree with this approach or not agree with this approach, right? We know that this approach exists. And whether it's true that it affects your ability to be a proper Kohen Gadol and ask for atonement properly, maybe yes, maybe no, one could argue. You know, some people might say it's not a wife, it's having children. Some people, right? There's all different theories about this. But one could propose a theory in that direction. They want him to have a family and a wife. And it's interesting because even if he had a wife, but she died, that wouldn't be sufficient, right? Needs to be married at the time. So therefore, we have a wife in standing. That's a very strange concept. You know, a wife in standing. Wonder what this woman's doing, right? She's just kind of waiting there. So let's kind of, okay, now come the rabbis. They didn't like this either, okay? Amrulo, in ken ein ledavar sof. You could take this very far. You know, what if that wife dies? What if that wife dies, right? And there's no end to this. You could go on forever. All sorts of issues. So basically they say this is not really a realistic solution. Why? They said this only by the woman and not by the Kohen Gadol, because you could say the same thing. Well, what if that Kohen Gadol becomes impure? And then you have to, you know, maybe you should have 10 Kohen Gadols in waiting. So it's interesting that they only say it by the woman. Maybe they just didn't like this concept of a wife in waiting, and they thought that that was a weird idea. Okay, Gemara starts off. The first thing the Gemara does is a little bit surprising, but it's not so surprising. If you've learned other Masechtot, they often start quoting from other places, other Mishnayot particularly. So Tanan Hatam. It says in a Mishnah there, I was still in the Yerushalmi language, Taman Tanidan, so it started with that. Tanan Hatam, you see how much learning the Yerushalmi affected me. So we learn in a Mishnah in Para. This is about the Para Aduma, the red heifer. Something very similar. Shivat Yamim Kodem Srefat Para. 7 days before they would burn the Para Aduma. Okay, let's talk about what the Para Aduma was. It was a red heifer. You would take it. You would, okay, first we're going to see, I'll start with here. היו מפרישים כהן השורף את הפרה מביתו ללשכה שעל פני הבירה צפון ומזרחה. He would go into a room. You would also separate him 7 days before, the kohen that's going to burn it. You would put him in a room that's on the northeast side, which is right near where we were, okay? We were over here in the Lishkat Paradlin, right opposite these tables in the Beit Mitbachayim. We talked about those 8 tables. This one is a little closer to the exit. It's right kind of on the wall where there's the wall, the gate of the Azara. So it's right around there. Okay, it doesn't even mention it on the map. It's like this corner area right here, flush against the wall of the entrance to the Azara. It's actually unclear to me exactly if it's considered in the Azara or right outside the Azara. It's right on the border there on the northern side. So now, what happened in the Para Aduma ritual? You would take the Kohen, he would go for 7 days. Then you would take a para, the red heifer. You would take it, you wouldn't have it in the temple. It was all done outside the temple on Har HaZeitim, on the Mount of Olives. You would first slaughter it. The Kohen sprinkles blood toward the direction of the Hechal, the sanctuary, from outside the sanctuaries. None of it's done inside. Then you would burn the para there. And then you would take the ashes, mix it with water, and you would create these purification waters, which were then used to purify people. So he would also have to go 7 days before, okay? The Lishkat Beit HaEven Aitanikre. That room was called the Lishkat Beit HaEven, the house of stones. The pictures of today, by the way, show some pictures of the Lishkat Paradrin, and it also shows what these kelim that they're going to talk about look like an example of what utensils like this would look like. We're going to talk about it. Why was it called Beit HaEven? Everything that had to do with the Paraduma was done particularly in utensils that either made of dung, animal dung, that's what most people think kalalim is. Some people say it might be something else. Clay avanim, made of stones, or made of adama, from the ground, the soil from the ground. My time, or what's the reason? Why only in those utensils? What makes those utensils unique? They cannot be susceptible to impurity. Okay, so we're going to be very strict about the impurity of the para, which we learned already in Shkalim, and we'll learn this again. Kevan de Tful Yom kasher bepara. There's going to be a long sentence. Since a Tful Yom, remember what a Tful Yom is? It's someone who goes to the mikvah, is impure, goes to the mikvah in the morning or sometime during the day, and has to wait till sunset to finalize the purification process. There was a big debate between the Prushim and the Tzdukim, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, about whether someone like that is allowed to burn the paradum. It says ish tahor. So the people who understand it literally, the Tzdukim, they say ish tahor. He has to be entirely pure. And the rabbis had a tradition that no, if he goes to the mikveh, he's already pure enough. That's fine, and he can do it. So to the extent that they had such a rivalry between them in general, and there were a lot of issues between them, which we're going to see more of them, it then says, so Tful Yom is kasher b'para, ditnan, as it says in the following Mishnah, mitamim hayu kohen. If you remember, we learned this in Shkalim, this crazy situation. They would on purpose, in order for the Prushim to make a point that we're right, they would purposely, every time someone dealt with the paraduma, they would make the person impure. And then they would put him in the mikveh that morning. And they would, some people say, the Rambam explains, they would throw a sheretz on him, make him impure. Some people say it was a little less of a real impurity. It was like a symbolic impurity because it seems weird, but let's assume it actually made him impure. They would put him in the mikveh. And therefore they wanted to say, we're against the tzdukim, we don't agree with you, and therefore we're going to make a point every time, show you that we disagree and make it public. Okay, this is like yesterday we saw about making it public, the Rosh Chodesh, that we want everyone to see, so they know it's Rosh Chodesh. Also this, they wanted to make it public that we disagree with the tzdukim on this issue. So therefore they would on purpose do it. Therefore, now we're still in the middle of a sentence. We started off with my timer. What's the reason why you have to separate him 7 days? They said, since a Tful Yom can do the para aduma, you might have thought, and we saw this also in Shkalim, therefore, they specifically used utensils that couldn't be susceptible to impurity, to lo lekablu tuma, that can't be susceptible to impurity. We were concerned that they didn't want anyone to say, oh, look, they do it with the Tful Yom, maybe they're not so careful about purity and impurity. Therefore, they bent over backwards in other areas to make sure there was no impurity at all. Okay? This reminds me, by the way, of something else I want to say in the introduction, which is the whole idea of Stukim and Prushim. We're going to see also throughout our Masechet. We're going to see that the Kohen Gadol, there's a seam where they are worried because some of the Kohanim Gadolim were Stukim from the Sadducees, and therefore they were worried that the Kohen Gadol, they kind of ask him some questions to make sure he's not. And then he answers, right, he starts crying and they start crying. He's crying that they suspect him and they're crying that they have to suspect him. And it's actually a big question about the Mishnayot that we're going to learn. It's a very descriptive, it's like Psachim, where we started off, first of all, it goes chronologically, like in Psachim, where we started from first, the night of the 14th, when you start checking the chametz. Then we went through the day and all the sacrifices. And then we got to the night only at the end of Leila Seder. Likewise here, we're going to start with 7 days before. We're going to go through the whole process chronologically and also descriptively. It describes what happened, and it's not necessarily every element is a halacha. Does the Kohen have to cry? Is it a law? No, it's just describing what went on in the times. This was part of the way of the rabbis of the Mishnah, trying to revive what happened in the temple and bring it alive to people. It's probably the same reason why we read the avoda in our prayer, so that we revive it a little bit and kind of envision. It's one of the reasons why we're learning all this, so we can have an idea of what really went on in the temple when the temple was so central to their lives. So in any case, let's move on. So now that's why we understand. So now they use this, they did it in the Lishkat Emen, where there were only stone and other kind of utensils that couldn't become impure, to make sure that nobody thinks that we're not careful about laws of impurity when it comes to the Para Aduma. Why does it have to be on the northeast side, the Lishkav, where the Kohen goes, in the Para Aduma case? It says about the Para Aduma, it's chatat, even though it's not a sin offering, but it does use the word chatat, which sounds like sin offering, right? Because it's not a sacrifice at all. V'chatat tu'unat safon. Now the chatat, a regular sin offering, has to be slaughtered in the north because it's kodshei kodshim, as I said. Uktiv ba el nochach pnei ol moed. Because it says you have to sprinkle the blood toward the direction of ol moed. Now that explains safon. What about mizrach? So now they say, Tekinu la Rabbanan lishkat tzfon mizracha. Because it says el nochach pnei ol moed, you're supposed to sprinkle the blood facing the ol moed. Where do you face the ol moed? When you're on the east side, that's where you're facing the entrance. So that's where they would do it on the east part. The north part was because it's like a chatat. The east side, because of that, we want it also to be noticeable. We want people to notice this. Okay, we saw that in yesterday's stuff also about wanting people to notice things. Rashi says, in other words, we wanted him to know those details, that this is called a chatat, even though it's not really a sin offering. And it needs mizrach, so you face the Ol Moed. We want to make sure the Kohen knows, again, this is about focusing, knows what's ahead of him and what he has to focus on. You have to remember, by the way, I didn't mention this, but the Kohanim Gedolim, right, besides also, this is the Kohen, regular Kohen, but the Kohanim Gedolim in those days also were not necessarily the best Kohen Gadol. They also switched every year. We were talking about the end of Second Temple times. It was a bit corrupt. They would switch every year. So imagine, right? Every year you had a new Kohen Gadol. You need to know the laws. You need to understand what's ahead of him. Also, the Kohen Gadol, you might think about it. The Kohen Gadol didn't work every day. He's kind of like a manager. The manager isn't involved in the day-to-day. They don't always know all the details of everything. They're usually the people who are the least involved in the details. And you usually go to someone lower who can tell you they know their specialty very well. The higher ups usually don't know all the details. So you can understand all this preparation that the Kohen Gadol needed. Also the Kohen HaSorefet HaParah. How often does that happen? Not so often. So you need this idea of preparation and understanding what's ahead of you. My bira, the next question is, what's this bira? It said, al pnei bira. What's the bira? There was a special place called the Bira, and that's what we're referring to. No, it meant in the temple. The whole temple was called the Bira. It wasn't necessarily designating a specific place. And they quote a verse that mentions the Mikdash called a Bira. Now we're getting to the main part of our daf, which is we now have this idea of we've compared the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim and the Kohen Asoref et HaPara, who's burning the Para Aduma. Both need to be separated before bringing the Korban, right? 7 days before doing their whatever they need to do. So now the Gemara wants to know, where do we get this from? Okay, this is from our parsha we just read. Now we're going to quote a lot of psukim. I brought the verses on the page. So if you look at the page, you can see the different verses quoted. This is a verse about the Miluim, which were, right, they had 7 days of preparation when they did Chanukat Mishkan, when they sanctified the Mishkan, in the beginning when the opening ceremony. And on the 8th day, that's Parshat Shmini that we just read, Vayi Bayom Shmini, that was the day. So now they're going to compare that day to the Para Aduma day and the Yom Kippurim day. And it says in that verse, like Kasher Asa Bayom Hazeh, as he did on that day, Tzivah Hashem la'asot lechaper alechem. God commanded them to do this for atonement. Okay, it says la'asot, to do, lechaper. We're going to darshan those two words. So Amar Rabbi Amar Kra, so that's what the pasuk says. La'asot is a reference elu ma'aseh para. They're going to say that's a reference to the para, just like the Kohanim were designated before, 7 days before, and then they only did it on the 8th day, the work. Likewise here, they're going to need 8 days. La'asot is a reference to the Para Aduma. Lechaper elu ma'aseh Yom Kippurim. The rest of today's daf is going to be trying to figure out why la'asot is specifically para and not other options, and why lechaper is only Yom Kippurim and not other options. There's a lot of times we see atonement in the Torah, a lot of days that are days of atonement. It's true, this is the day of atonement, and that's why I said when we started, we're going to see this theme about this is the day, okay? And therefore, all of this, I think, leads to saying how central this one day was compared to any other day in the year, and they're doing it by method of these drashot and saying, oh, why this, why not that, in terms of saying this day stands alone, it's different from every other day. First, we're going to talk about the Para Aduma. We'll only get back to Yom Kippurim after. So, Lasot elu maseh para, lechaper, that's maseh Yom Kippurim. Bishlama kule kra bepara lo metuka. Lechaper ktiv. Clearly, lechaper is not referring to the Para Aduma because there is no atonement in the Para Aduma. Upara la bat kaparai. It's not like a sacrifice that you're bringing for atonement purposes. Ela ema, but you could just say kule kra b'yom kippurim. In other words, you can't say that whole verse is referring to Para Aduma because lechaper has nothing to do with Para Aduma. But you could say la'asot lechaper maybe is all a reference to Yom Kippurim and not the Para Aduma. So they say the way we know it's a reference to Para Aduma is from a Gzeira Shava. Gzeira Shava is when one word appears here and the same word appears elsewhere. We're going to say those are the same. We're going to learn one from one to the other. And you only do it really when you have a tradition about it. So Amr, Yalif Tziva Tziva. Ktiv Hacha. Tziva Hashem Lasso. That's the verse we just quoted by the Miluim. Uchtiv Hatam, and by Para Aduma it says, Zot Chulchat Torah Asher Tziva Hashem Lemor. These are the laws that God commanded. Now you might say, God commands all over the Torah, right? And the Gemara is going to do that, so have no fear. But right now we're going to say, it says Tziva Hashem there, it says Tziva Hashem there. Therefore, the Tziva Hashem la'asot must be a reference to that. So malahalam para, avkan para. So just like there it's para, also here it's para. Umakam prisha, and just like by the Miluim, they had these 7 days where they were separated before the 8th day. Likewise here, we have these 7 days where we're separated before he does the Para Aduma service. But now the Gemara is going to question. Ve'ema tziva tziva di Yom Kippurim. But wait, by Yom Kippur, we were trying to say before, why don't you just say, Asher tziva Hashem l'chaper, la'asot l'chaper is all a reference to Yom Kippur. And we said no, because it says tziva Hashem. But also by Yom Kippur, it says tziva Hashem. So that's not a good proof. Dichtiv, vayasu kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe. Vayas kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe. At the end of all the Avodat Yom Kippurim, when it talks in the Torah, in Parshat Achremot about what the Kohen Gadol does, it then says, and he did just like God commanded him. So there you have, Tziva Hashem, same thing. So what did they answer? And this is classic with Gzeira Shava. We're going to pick the one that's more similar. How so? Danim tziva de lifnei asiyah mitziva de lifnei asiyah. The first two references by the Paraduma and the Miluim, it was kind of introducing what's going to happen. This is what God commanded to do, and then you hear what God commands to do. But there it was saying, and the Kohen did just as God had commanded him in the past. So therefore, it's not the same use of Tzivah Hashem, and therefore we're going to learn from Paraduma and not to the Kohen Gadol. Again, Kohen Gadol is learned out from the word L'chaper, but not to say the whole verse is referring only to the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. But we're going to find another tzivah. Ve'ema tzivah de korbanot. Why don't you say tzivah of sacrifices? Maybe anytime you bring a sacrifice, you're a Kohen, you're working in the temple, maybe you should also need 7 days of prep before, where you separate from your house and you go to a special place in the temple. Maybe you should do that 7 days before every time there's sacrifices. Why would we think this? Besides, we might think it because it makes sense, because any kind of, right, we already learned that you have to have intent and the proper intent, and maybe you really need to leave, right? Not just work 2 weeks a year and on the holidays, right? Basically, come when it's your week, but maybe the week before, if you know you're the one doing the sacrificing, you should separate 7 days before. Why would we think this? Dichtiv, beyond, right? Not just what we think it logically, but also the pasuk says, if the whole thing is from Tzivah Hashem, what does it say about korbanot? B'yom tzavotot b'nei Israel, on the day he commanded b'nei Israel. So there you also have tzavotot. It's the same root as tzivah, to which the Gemara says, no. Danim tzivah mitzivah, ve'ein danim tzavotot mitzivah. We've seen this kind of structure before. We're going to learn when you have, right, we're going to say tzivah, we're going to learn from tzivah, and we're not going to learn from tzavotot to tzivah. Those are two different forms of the same word. So we can't learn from one to the other. To which the Gemara says, umay nafkamina, why? Why should there be any difference? And in fact, not just are they saying that, but we see all over, first of all, that they use the same root as Gzera Shava, even though it's not the same form of the word. And all the more so, they always quote this example whenever they have this question by Mitzorah, by the leprous house. It says there's a Gzera Shava about 2 words. Forget about they're not the same. They're not even the same root. Forget about they're not the same conjugation. They're also not the same root. V'hatan is be Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael says, in the house of Rabbi Yishmael, they had a braita that said, V'shava kohen u'ba'al kohen, zohi shiva, zohi bia. Where it says there, the kohen, okay, this is good. It's all about quarantining the house. Okay, we all know about quarantine these days. So it says there, you're supposed to quarantine the house for 7 days. If you come back and it's still there, you're supposed to do the process, which is you take out the stones where the leprous marks are. You then take off the limestone and then you plaster it again. Then it says you wait another 7 days then to see if it spreads. After that, right, very, very similar to our quarantine. Then you basically, I mean, it's a little different there. We're avoiding spreading. Here we want to see, did it spread? Then after you quarantine the house for another 7 days, it doesn't say what you're supposed to do. Now you might think at that point, you're supposed to destroy the house already if it spread. It's still there. So it says there, Uba Kohen, and they say, since the first verse it said V'shava Kohen, and the second case it says Uba Kohen, it's similar, even though it's not exactly the same, because the verbs are different. But they say it's the same thing after the second quarantine. It's only after the third that you destroy the house. So you would do the exact same process the second time as you would do the first time, which shows that you can make a Zera Shava from 2 words that aren't the same. And this is the answer we always give when we have this kind of question. That's only if you don't have another word that's more similar to it. Then you can do the Zera Shava, v'shav, uba. Okay. But when you have, and then you could do, let's say, from Savoto to Tziva. But when you have, if we're already collecting options, we're saying, do you want to learn Paraduma from here, or do you want to learn sacrifices? We're going to take the one, if Savoto appears by sacrifices and Tziva Hashem exactly as it appears in the verse of the Miluim, it's exactly the same. We're going to choose that one over that one. So it's a matter of which is more similar. If you didn't have Tziva Hashem by Parat, then you could have learned it to Korbanot, to sacrifices. But since you have a better option, we're going to go with that. So that was all about the last. So it's teaching you Paraduma. How do we know it's not teaching you Yom Kippur? And how do we know it's not teaching you other sacrifices? And we prove that because Tziva Hashem is the most similar by Paraduma as it is to the Miluim. Now we're going to go to the second part, which is L'chaper Elo Maseh Yom Kippurim. And you can see from the chart, we're going to have 4 different options as to what could have been learned from the word L'chaper. As you know, atonement comes up in many different cases. Why we learn specifically Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur, and not to these other situations. So the first we're going to start with is, again, sacrifices. The aim, we're going to be from the most general to getting more and more specific to something specific. Ema kapara de korbanot. And so maybe you would say, kapara, atonement. Most sacrifices come for atonement purposes. Mi adinan he kohen, mitrare de baile prisha. So the first question is, well, you don't know who's the Kohen that's going to actually bring the sacrifice. We all go, we're Kohanim. We all go when it's our week, but we split up the jobs differently. There's a pious, we draw lots. Whatever I get. Maybe I'm not going to be a Kohen that needs to sacrifice. So maybe I wouldn't know then to separate 7 days before. That's not a good answer, because you could just make everybody who's supposed to come that week separate for 7 days. Okay, if you don't end up doing a sacrifice, so you don't, but what's the big deal? Separate 7 days. So they obviously weren't worried about the husbands leaving the wives behind for a longer period of time. That wasn't their concern. Danim davarsha kavu alozman mi davarsha, right? It reminds me of like miluim or people who travel for work, right? That they go for a longer period of time, right? You don't want to leave your house for so long, but in any case, they're not worried about that. So what do they answer? Here comes our issue that I mentioned earlier about the importance of that day. Danim davarsha kavu alozman mi davarsha kavu alozman. We learn about something that's time related. You need to separate 7 days before, to something, or the miluim that's time related, right? The miluim was a one-time thing. We learn from there to a one-time event, one time a year, rather than lafuke korbanot dechol yomi inu. This is kind of the reverse of what we ended our last Masechet with tadir v'sheino tadir kodem, right? What comes every day is sometimes has more significance, but now we're going to say, well, something that happens once a year is unique, and that's why it needs the prisha of 7 days. Ve'ema regalim. Okay, well, you want something that's kavua lozman, once every while. So let's go with holidays. Holidays, there's sacrifices for atonement. So the answer, danim davar shenoheg pamachat b'shana mi davar noheg pamachat b'shana. No, the regalim happen 3 times a year. Let's pick something that happens 1 time a year. Lafuke regalim de la pamachat b'shana ninu, right? They're not once a year. Ve'ema regal achad. Let's choose one holiday. How about that? Then we can do that. V'chitema, if you want to say lo yadin and heminayu, maybe you don't know which one. Maybe Pesach, because because the Torah starts with that. That's the first mitzvah. Or there's a lot of mitzvah. You have the 4 species. You have the sukkah to build. Maybe that one. But again, the miluim structure is more similar. It's 7 days for 1 day. Likewise, but we're not going to learn separate 7 days for 7 days, because those holidays are 7 days long. Ve'ema shmini. What about Shmini Atzeret, which is 1 day? Why don't you say that? So they said, because Shmini Atzeret is considered its own holiday. Danim davar she'en kedusha lefanav mi davar she'en kedusha lefanav. But that has a holiday before it. It already is sanctified before, so therefore you don't need to separate. Again, 7 days of miluim to the 8th day, where the 8th day was sanctified. 7 days before Yom Kippur to the day of Yom Kippur. That's not similar to Shmini Atzeret, which is coming off of a 7-day holiday already. But then they say, "V'lav kavachomer." Wouldn't it be a kavachomer? They would be obvious then. Something that has no sanctity before, you need to separate 7 days. If it has sanctity before, all the more so you should have to separate. So no, why not? Hazektiv, the whole verse where we learned it from the Miluim said, this day, kazeh. It has to be exactly like this. You want to find a day, it's exactly like this, and that's going to be Yom Kippur and not Shmini Atzeret, which is coming off of a 7-day holiday. Rav Ashi Amar. So now we're going to say, mi ikamidi di ikar rega lo bai prisha, tafel di day bai prisha. If you're going to also another problem with Shmini Atzeret, you're going to say we're going to take a day that comes after the 7-day holiday. The 7-day holiday didn't need separation, and now all of a sudden the 8th day is going to need separation. That also doesn't make any sense. We're going to stop here for today. We're going to pick up with the next line of saying that really maybe Shmini Atzeret is its own holiday entirely. What do you do with that? And we'll pick up from there. Hope you enjoyed the first daf of Masechet Yoma. Have a Chodesh Tov to everyone, and we'll meet up tomorrow.